Day 4 of the U.S. Championship saw some critical results for the standings as the reigning champions Fabiano Caruana and Carissa look to defend their titles this year. Starting with the open section, Caruana managed to defeat Abhimanyu Mishra in a nice technical game, taking the lead for the first time in the event as he aims for his third straight title. Other results saw Robson defeating Awonder Liang with black, the rest of the games being drawn. That means Caruana is now in the sole lead with 3 out of 4, with Niemann, and Sevian all a half point behind on 2.5 out of 3. In the U.S. Women's Championships, Carissa ended up defeating the 8-time champion Irina Krush in an absolutely crucial game, staying on a perfect 4 out of 4 in her campaign to repeat as champion. A full point behind with 3 out of 4 is Begim Tokhirjonova, who defeated Zatonskih in today's round, while Yip's closest rival going into today, Tatev Abrahamyan, lost to Megan Lee, as she is now 1.5 points behind the lead with 2.5 out of 4. Going into the games, we'll start with the game between Caruana and Mishra, which featured a French. Here, Caruana goes for knight c3, the classical variation, and then e5 and knight to e2 instead of the main line with f4. And Mishra actually gets out of the opening quite all right in this one. After g3, h4, black takes on d4 and goes f6, ef6, and now bishop to b4 check. Kind of an interesting nuance in order to take on f6 with the queen. Knight c3, and here black actually ends up taking with the knight on f6, but queen takes f6 was another idea. Bishop g2, bishop d7, castles, and here black is quite all right. The bishop is able to escape the pawn chain, and black just has this one weakness on e6, but it doesn't seem to be such a big deal as the rest of black's position is pretty active. However, Caruana does end up getting a bit of an advantage here later on, as Mishra goes for some complications here. He takes on d4, wins a pawn, but white goes rook to b4, black defends the b pawn, and now white wins back the pawn. And the players end up in this position where basically black is left with an isolated king pawn, and white is just kind of piling up on this one. So I think with best play with computer defense, this one should have been a draw, but it really wasn't so easy in practice, as Caruana now goes f4, piling up on the pin along the e-file. And yes, not so easy to defend this one with tactics. Mishra did manage for some time, but here he goes rook to d8. I think the engine was giving some shot with h5 and rook d2 check as leading to a draw, but computer stuff. So rook e8, rook e3, check, queen comes back, now queen h5 and h6. I think the engine was once again saying like queen to d3 was the best defense, but h6, Caruana takes the pawn now on e5, queen c6, queen to g4, and at this point, had black played rook to e6, he's still kind of holding the position. White, of course, has an extra pawn and very decent winning chances, but it doesn't seem to be decisive quite yet. Instead, Mishra on move 39 goes rook f8. In time trouble, he's been in time trouble for a while. e6, rook f1, threatening mate on h1, but now just queen to e4. White covers everything, and black is forced to trade queens and go into a very, very bad rook endgame. So this one ends up winning for Caruana as he just brings the king up. Rook to c4 is a nice touch. The king and pawn endgame is going to be winning. Rook to d8, now white's rook enters the 7th rank, and Caruana's technique here was definitely good enough as he wins the second pawn and eventually does convert this one pretty smoothly. Wins the third pawn, king comes up, and yeah, black can only resist for so long here. Rook c6 takes, king takes h6, and here Mishra resigned as now the win is really rather trivial. So big win for Caruana as Niemann did not win today's game. Neither did so now Caruana takes the clear lead with 3 out of 4 in the U.S. Championship. Moving to the U.S. Women's Championship, big game today between Irina Krush and Carissa. Irina a couple points behind Carissa in the standings, so definitely looking to win this game and catch up. Carissa in the lead, and of course looking to win once again and win a second straight title in a row. And she goes for a very, very risky line, the so-called Gingy Indian with c5 and bishop takes c3 followed by e5. But this one is quite playable, leads to a very, very closed and difficult strategic position. And yeah, this game ended up being very, very complicated, very messy. I think Krush was caught a little bit out of prep on this one, not exactly sure how to develop her pieces, but she ends up going with something pretty classical and standard. But the position ends up being very double-edged as Carissa now plays king d8 and king c7, taking advantage of the closed position to bring the king over to the queen side. And yeah, things get very, very difficult here as both players basically build up on their side of the board. Black just blockades here with b6, very hard for white to break through, so she plays f3. But now black's kingside counterplay starts coming in, and Carissa's position actually for a while here did look very, very good. As she builds up on the king side, king comes back to c7, knight e7, queen h7, and eventually here black does prepare f5 and start opening things up. So now the game gets very, very sharp. ef, knight f5, knight to g4, h3, black looking to open up the king side and go after white's king, rook to f8, king to g1, knight e7. I think the engine here was giving the e4 break at this moment, forcing white to take with the pawn, and then looking to use the open lines with moves like knight h6 and so on. But knight e7, queen g6, knight f2, and then at this moment, Carissa throws down e4, and Irina really should have taken with the knight, and had she done so, she would have actually had very good winning chances in this game, as this one gives white the advantage. For example, black's idea was likely to play g4 and undermine the knight, but then white could play bishop to d3 with threats of knight takes c5, for example, lining up the bishop against the queen. I was looking at maybe knight to e5 here, or queen to h5, then white could take, queen takes g4, knight to g5. And yeah, engine gives white a big advantage here. Of course, it's very, very complicated, but had she found this, this would have definitely been quite nice. Instead, we saw f takes e4, allowing Carissa to execute her idea, rook takes f2. Very, very interesting exchange sacrifice. King takes f2, and now queen takes e4. All of a sudden, black's pieces are coming in. Queen to g2 check is a big problem for white. The knight is coming to e5 as well. And yeah, here black just gets a major attack, so position completely explodes. Bishop takes g5, check, queen takes h2. Irina grabs on e7, now takes on g3. Queen f4 check, white's king ends up running to the queen side. After queen e4 check, king b3, queen takes e7, we're left with this material imbalance where black is actually down the exchange, but has a very, very strong h-pawn, and white's pieces are all piled up on the queen side. So really, really interesting endgame that the players find themselves in. Of course, actually at this point, they're about to reach move 40, so king a3, queen h4, they get the extra time to play this out. And objectively, I think this position is close to equal or close to a draw, but ends up being very, very tricky for white to play, as this h-pawn is just super, super annoying to deal with. White also has to keep the king defended, like the c-pawn, for example. So yeah, what ends up happening here is the players repeat a couple times the bishop f1, queen h4, bishop d3, but now Carissa decides to go for it, go for the win with knight to e5. Very, very nicely calculated here, hitting the bishop, hitting the c-pawn. Irina takes on b6. This is a critical move. And now knight takes d3. And here rook to b7 check apparently would have held the draw for white, or led to a forced draw. After king to d8, queen to b5, we have some tremendous complications, but basically white is going to be able to force perpetual at some point. Instead, Krush played queen to b5, which is a lot more natural, threatening queen c6 check. But now comes knight to b4, and this was likely what Chris had calculated. I think Krush also had seen this ahead of time. Fantastic shot, blocking the b file. So now if white takes with the pawn on b4, black will go a takes b4 check, for example, king moves, and then rook takes b6. All of a sudden, black is a piece up and has a completely winning position. So instead, white plays rook takes a6. The engine gives rook to f1 as holding a draw. Good luck finding that with no time on the clock. So rook takes a6, much more logical response. Bishop takes a6, queen takes a5 check, king to d7. White has time to grab the knight on b4, but now the queen ends up being completely cut off from the game on a5. And Carissa correctly realized that she's actually winning this one just by bringing in her queen with a bunch of checks, getting counterplay, and then eventually using the h-pawn. So that's what ends up happening here. Queen e5 check, king to c2. It's very hard for white to find a good square for the king, as the queen of course, wants to get in. The bishop also wants to get in, so king a2, bishop takes c4. That's immediately over. But here, Carissa manages to find the right sequence of checks. Queen e2 takes on c4 with check, and now queen to d4, and now the bishop is ready to get involved. And yeah, this is just lost for white. So if king a3, for example, then there's queen c3 check. Let's say rook to b3, then queen a1 mate. Or if king a2, then there's going to be bishop c4, and it's all over. So in the game, we saw king to b2, or king to c1, excuse me. If king c2, then there's bishop d3 check. Bishop gets involved this way, and that's end of the game as well. And after king c1, it was queen c3 check, king d1. And here the bishop doesn't have any good checks, but there is h2. And that just ends the game, as now the pawn is promoting and white can't stop it. White doesn't have any good checks of her own. So incredible win by Carissa. Very, very sharp, chaotic game, but she manages to take it in the complications and get a commanding lead, full point lead over the field right now going into tomorrow's round 5. Speaking of, in tomorrow's round 5, we'll see Carissa Yip with white against her nearest rival, Begim, who's a full point behind. We'll see if Begim can manage to score a win or at least draw and slow Carissa down. Meanwhile, in the open section, we'll have Caruana playing black against Christopher Yu, the reigning U.S. junior champion. So a bunch of very interesting matchups coming up. Hopefully, I'll see you folks back here for the recap. Until then, take care.